Right. Well, we come on to part four of the story. We're back to Alfred Burrows, although we're starting with a photograph here of the 1st Battalion of the Leicestershire Regiment in South Africa. And that's for two reasons. The first reason is really because we've seen a lot of photographs so far, but we haven't actually talked about photographs as a source or a resource for research, and they really are a very important one. There are a lot of photographs out there, aren't there, Jenny? A lot of photographs.
Yeah. Absolutely loads at your local library or archive service.
Yes, and you can, and there are photographs of people, so you may well get a portrait of somebody you're interested in. There are photographs of places and events and all sorts of things. So if one of your ancestors was in the Leicestershire Regiment and you have no photograph of him, but you know that he was in the 1st Battalion in the late 1890s, you can get a photograph like this one, and on there somewhere is your ancestor, which is quite pleasing. Even if you can't pinpoint him, we can name a few of these people. We can even name the horse at the front is called Felix, for example. But most of the soldiers, we don't know their names. But somewhere in amongst them is Alf Burrows. So there you are. That's really why we're looking at this photograph. And we're on to really the army life, because Alf went into the army, as many men did, particularly in the 20th century, of course, with the conscription in the First World War and Second World War. Millions, literally millions of people, women as well, were conscripted to service for their country. And so military life, if you like, is a very important aspect, and it's one that we're going to explore a little bit. It's easy to do too. It's rather pleasing, and a lot of the research facilities that are available are geared up for it. So this is a glance. We've seen a page like this before. This is Find My Past. Ancestry is almost exactly the same. They won't like us to say that, but they're very similar, and they're devoted to getting researchers the information they want. And you'll see that one of the things highlighted green on the left there is military, armed forces and conflict. And it's very easy to do research. You can just put in a name, John Smith, and you'll get hundreds of results, too many with something like John Smith. So you'll have to fine tune it a bit. But something like Alfred Burrows, you can put it in and you actually get 2 Alfred Burrows results and 1 Albert Burrows. We'll come back to Albert Burrows later, that Albert Burrows. But there we are. There are 2 records from Alfred Burrows. Born 1875. Well, don't worry too much about that. He's actually 1876, I think, isn't he, Jenny?
Yes, it is.
But he's a Leicester man, born in 1875-ish. So, okay, we'll go for that, and we'll have a look and see what we come up with. And in fact, what we come up with is a militia attestation record. Now, the militia was a sort of dad's army of its day, if you like, a sort of citizens' army, a reserve force, like the territorials. And people went into it. They would turn out for drills at the weekend and have a summer camp and so on. And they were there in case the country was invaded. But like a lot of institutions, it recorded its members. So when you enlisted in the army, or the militia in this case, it would note down your name, your date of birth, where you lived, and distinguishing marks and things like that. They quite often paid a bounty on people joining. So they didn't want people joining again and again and again and deserting in between. So they would take down a description. And often it's one of those things, the army, prisons and so on, institutions which recorded in great detail a description physically of the people who were going in. So we have a description of Alfred Burrows going into the militia, where he came from and so on. And it records that he is a shoe pressman. So there he is, 17 years and 8 months old. Actually, I think he's lying about his age still. He's going into the army, and he's having a bit of experience. Now, why did he pick the militia? Well, Here's a photograph of the Leicestershire Militia about, I don't know, sometime in the 1890s, late 1890s. And there they are, rather splendid looking in their red coats and blue helmets with brass spikes on and so on. And you can imagine that perhaps 10 years earlier that Alf Burrows was one of these lads in the front, watching them go by and thinking, yes, that looks quite good fun, you know, comradeship, a summer camp, marching about, drilling, that sort of thing. It looks good, you know, playing at soldiers almost. It looks like good fun. So if he'd come from a slightly unhappy home, which it seems he did with his I insist on calling his wicked stepmother, you know, maybe he thought the militia was a sort of self-improvement thing. The Victorians were great on self-improvement, weren't they? So he went in for that. And in fact, within a few months, he'd obviously decided that the regular army was the thing for him. He liked the army life. He'd joined the army proper. It may be that because he was young, that they said, well, before you join up properly, try the militia for a bit, see if it suits you. And it clearly did, because in June 1893, he joined the Leicestershire Regiment, the regular army, and he went out to the West Indies and then to South Africa, where we caught up with him with that photograph that we started with. And this is the sort of record you will get about soldiers. Very useful. Same in the First World War. Next page will give you things like family details, next of kin, all this sort of thing. And it tells you whether they've served in the army before. It tells you how old they are. Again, Alfred, I'm afraid, is lying. He wasn't 18 years and 3 months. He was about a year younger than that, I think. But he was in the regular army, and he was a pretty good bargain. This is the military district enlistment register from the same period, because it records his enlistment again in a slightly different form. And this is really, it's a one-off, this one, Jenny, isn't it? Because this is the only one of a series of records that survives. It was found, I think, at the depot at Glenparva and sent into the record office from there. Just a one-off, and it's a nice volume, and it records all the enlistments in the Leicester area for the 1890s. So it's very useful for South African War, Boer War soldiers. And amongst them, there is our Alfred Burrows, indicated with a delightful little yellow arrow. And there he is. He says he's 18 years and 2 months. Well, he isn't. But he is 5 foot 5 3/4 inches tall, which is quite small, really. I think the average of a man nowadays is 5'9", isn't it, Jenny? I think.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
I think it strikes people, doesn't it, when they look at soldiers' records, how tiny some of them were.
Yes, and their chest size and things like, you know, his chest measurement is what, 35 and 36 inches. 36 inches is inflated. So if you breathe in, you grow a little bit. He grew an inch, and he's only 124 pounds. So he's really quite a puny specimen.
Yeah, but he's only a lad at this point, isn't he?
Absolutely right, Jenny, because he's only a lad, and also he's probably not been terribly well fed, and he hasn't had a lot of exercise. But the army, you know, regularly, they kept records, and they took in these puny little lads, and they put on about 3 inches in height and quite a few pounds in weight, simply from regular exercise and food. And I imagine that Alf Burrows was the same. But, you know, the rest of it, you can almost visualize him. His description is there. He's a sallow complexion. He's got dark brown eyes, dark brown hair. He's even got a scar behind his right leg. So you could sort of, you know, if you met him, you'd almost recognize him. So it's a very valuable, nice record, this one. And off he went with the army to South Africa. He may well be one of these fellas in this photograph, because he became a signaller with the Leicestershire Regiment, and these are some of the signallers. The trouble is they're all fairly skinny fellas with a sallow complexion and dark brown hair. So, you know, any one of those could be Alf Burrows. Yeah. But he wrote, the remarkable thing about him, in his tiny signaller's handwriting. He wrote umpteen letters home, didn't he, Jenny? And would you like to read what he wrote about military service?
I will. He says, a man enlists for 12 years, 7 with the colours and 5 with the reserve. Should he finish his 12 years in wartime, the country forces him to stay on another 12 months, which he never signed on for.
Yeah, it really annoyed Alf. I don't think he had a happy time in the army, and it really annoyed him that they kept him on another year just because he happened to have unfortunately finished his service in the middle of the Boer War. So it very much peeved him. He finished his service in the Boer War in one of these blockhouses that they built across the veldt, really to pin down the Boer commandos, to stop that fluid warfare. But he, as I say, he wrote regular letters home, and we have.
There's his handwriting.
That's it. It's beautiful, very neat, tiny. That is blown up to about 4 times the actual size, so it's really tiny but very neat, indelible pencil. It is. But he wrote home to Albert. And what did he write to Albert? He told Albert that he'd send him some South African stamps for his stamp collection. And when he came home, he'd tell him interesting stories about the wild animals in Africa and so on. But he had some advice. Do you want to read us his advice?
Yeah, this is interesting, isn't it? He says, but Albert, never go for a soldier. If you do, you will regret it as long as you live. Which
is very telling of an old soldier writing, isn't it? And the interesting thing is, do you remember I said we'll meet Albert again? Albert was the 3rd name on that form, and they got him in the end. He was conscripted in the First World War, and he spent the entire war in the Royal Garrison Artillery and was actually discharged with a bad heart in 1919. That's what had happened to Albert. He did survive the war, thank goodness, but he didn't avoid military service. He didn't take his uncle's advice, did he?
He didn't. We should have said that was a spoiler alert there.
Yes, I suppose that's right. But here we are, 1915, another photograph, and this is the town hall. We all know the town hall in Leicester. And in 1915, they were very worried that they weren't getting enough recruits and slapped across the front of the town hall a big poster announcing that it was a recruiting office. The ground floor was given over to as a recruiting office, and that they wanted 5,000 more soldiers. Or rather, 2,000 more soldiers. That there were 5,000 Leicesters at the front, and they wanted 2,000 more to join them. And it's a very interesting photograph. You can see the recruiting sergeants lined up outside, and I often think that little group on the right, just by the motor car, it's very typical pose. There's a staff sergeant there with his cap on, and you can see the ribbon attached to the cap. He's a recruiting sergeant, and he's got that chap. You can see by his body language, it really is very telling that he's sort of leaning back. He's in his stride, and you can almost hear him say, "Well, lad, you look like a fine specimen of a fellow. Have you ever thought of serving your country?" And this sort of thing. But the sad thing is that Alf, who had come out of the army after the South African War, married and was working as an attendant at the mental hospital, the Towers Mental Hospital, he saw this and he thought, well, I've got to do my duty. And he did enlist. And he wrote to his wife explaining his motives. And it's very interesting to have basically a Victorian man explaining his feelings. It's very rare indeed, isn't it? And can you bear to read it again? Because I think it's worth hearing, Jenny, if you don't mind.
Yeah, of course. He says to his wife, "I hope you will not reproach me for taking this step and bringing misery upon us all, but I saw my duty and could not bear that others should think me a coward for having failed in that duty, and I am pleased that my children will grow up and will not have to hide their heads in shame because their father had not the courage to go, at whatever cost, in peace of mind to him and others. I know you love me, dearest, and I know and feel extraordinarily proud that you willingly allowed me to go."
Thank you. That's I still find that very moving. And I've read that many times. And there he is. There's Alfred. He's a corporal. So he's back in the army. He's a corporal, and you notice he's wearing his two medal ribbons, his Queen and King's South African medal ribbons up. So he re-enlisted back in the Leicestershire Regiment. He's wearing the tiger cap badge, beautifully polished, isn't it? Absolutely
Yeah.
It's a real regular soldier's cap badge there.
Attract enemy snipers with that.
It's very true. Right. So those of you with good eyesight will recognise Barnard Castle. The medieval castle are behind the group of soldiers in the distance, and there they are. They're lined up. These are the officers and NCOs of A Company of the 10th Battalion, the Leicestershire Regiment, the training battalion, and almost in the middle is Lance Corporal Alf Burrows, and there he is with his South African War medals up and so on, and a magnificent moustache. Really, the moustache, as I say, of an old soldier. So he's there. He's probably the man who knew best what they were supposed to be doing in the entire picture. There he is. So from Barnard Castle, they went to Cannock Chase. They moved to Cannock Chase for further training. And really, this slide it exemplifies that quite often, if you're researching your ancestors, there are physical remains to see. There are, you can go to the church where they were married. You might be able to go to the grave where they're buried, this sort of thing. Or you can go and see where they worked or where they did whatever they did. And in the case of Rugeley Camp on Cannock Chase, you can see the top left is actually the rifle butts, still very evident in the landscape. Vast, construction, far too big to demolish, to bulldoze flat, I suppose, which is why it survived. And there's a camp hut has been preserved. I think it was, weren't they using it as a some sort of club hut? And they said, we'll grab that and preserve it as a war memorial.
Yes, I think that's right. I've been cycling there.
Yes, and so there is that there, and they use it as an interpretation centre and so on, and slightly less distinct in the top right, but really rather interesting. You could just about see the zigzag, the sinuous form of a trench, and it's a practice trench. And Alf wrote home many times that he was out in the trenches all night on Cannock Chase, and that they were, digging trenches to practice how to dig them, and also living in them overnight and so on to practice trench warfare. So there are physical remains to be seen and experienced. However, inevitably, the time came when the training was over, and alas, it was time for Alf to join a draft for the front, and he was sent off to join one of the service battalions at the front. And again, can you bear to read again his letter home?
Yes, just in the corner there, isn't it?
Yes.
He says, I don't want Willie nor Frank ever to forget their dad, but I hope they won't fret much. I trust if anything should happen to me, they will grow up to be a real help and comfort to you, and a consolation for all you may lose. Kiss them for me and give them a good hug.
Yes. So he boarded a train and went off to France, and he joined the 9th Battalion of the Leicesters in the trenches just in front of Guédicourt on the Somme in 1916, September 1916. So it was after the bloodbath of the 1st of July, but they're even so facing the continuing offensive there. And we shall finish this section really looking at the war diary, because once you're in the army and on active service, the war diary is a wonderful source. It really is a wonderful source of information. It might not name your soldier individually. Sometimes it does, particularly if he's an officer. But it will tell you in great detail exactly where he was and what he was doing on any particular day. And on the 24th to the 27th of September 1916, the whole brigade, really, the 6th, 7th, 8th and 9th Leicesters, went into a major assault on Guerdicourt, and Alf Burrows was with them. And I'm afraid it was not good. They met very stiff resistance, and you read in you can read in the war diary that C Company, and Alf was in C Company, 12:45 on the 25th. They'd reached Gerd Trench, which was one of their targets. But it says, owing to machine gun fire, the party were all killed or wounded. And later on, it says that they reached another trench. It says that Captain Webb was wounded, Company Sergeant Major Rhodes was killed, and C Company suffered extremely heavy casualties from machine gun fire. So it's a story of successive disasters, really, befalling each company as they advanced. And the war diary of the 8th Battalion says, by the time reached the village, their ranks were sadly thinned by the tremendous artillery barrage the enemy put up and by machine guns which wrought terrible havoc. So it's a story of artillery and machine gun fire coming down very heavily on the Leicestershire Regiment. And we'll leave Alf there, stuck in no man's land, and we'll carry on that story another time.